Seated. Let's pray one more time. God, it truly is the blood of Jesus that saves us. It is, Jesus, your blood. We worship you for shedding your blood for us. We worship you for the reminder that we had just now of communion, of what you did to purchase us and rescue us from the penalty we deserve for our sins. We're reminded by the song we just sang before this one, about your resurrection, that you're alive and well right now. You're not dead in a grave. This is real. This is true. We've refreshed ourselves with the gospel. We've been reminded again of your death and resurrection, Jesus. And so now I pray that you would work in this room to make your word real to us. Make it come alive. Show us how relevant it is, please. In your name I pray, Jesus. Amen. All right, so have you ever had one of those days where things just didn't go the way you expected they would? That was my day yesterday. We got ready to go have fun at the mall, return some stuff, and we got the kids in the car and pressed the button, wouldn't start. Pressed the button again, wouldn't start. Pressed it again, wouldn't start. Click, 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 click. All you car people know what that is, but I don't know what that is. And so we're like, what in the world was that? And so eventually it started, just one of those things, cars just start. And so then, okay, we got this thing started, so let's drive over to the dealer. So we drive over to the dealer. They check and go, it's your battery. Do you want to buy a new one? And I know, dealers are all about, they upsell things. At least that's been my experience. So I'm like, I don't want you to touch that, actually. I'm going to go find out where I bought this. So I bought it at Costco, went to Costco. They're like, oh, it's under warranty. Great. Here's a free one. Great. Put it in the car. Take it home. I'm going to put it in. I'm going to switch it out, and put the new one in, get rid of the old one, and I don't have the tools to do that. Great. So I got to go to Home Depot. That's where they sell all the tools. So I get in my car. I drive over to Home Depot, and I don't have my wallet. I've got to drive back home, get my wallet, drive back to Home Depot, buy the tools, come back and put in the battery, only to find that the tools I bought did not work to help me get that battery in there. I just said to Katie, gosh, it's just one of those days, right? Like, what a day. Turn to Mark 13. Unexpected is clearly what the disciples thought when they heard Jesus say to them, as they're looking up at the temple, that not one stone of that temple is going to be left on the other, that all of it was going to be thrown down. They're kind of taken aback by that, and they're going, well, if that's true, Jesus, I don't want anything to do with that. And so look at verse 4. They say, tell us then, Jesus, when will these things be? When is this temple going to be destroyed? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? If this stuff's going to happen, Jesus, we want to be ready for this. So for the past 2 weeks, we've been walking our way through Mark 13. That's what we kind of do here. If you're new, we just kind of walk through the Bible. And we started out by saying, okay, Jesus is someone who should be listened to. If he says these things and they happen exactly as he says they will, we should listen to him. We should take him seriously. We shouldn't just think, oh, I know all this Jesus stuff, and yeah, Jesus is a great guy. We should really stop, check ourselves, and say, are we really taking him seriously in our lives? Because this is no gimmicky 1-900 number psychic stuff. This is the real thing. He predicts the future in detail. It happens exactly as he says it will. We're fools to ignore him. Then after that, the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing him describe a few things: false teachers, wars, earthquakes, famine, and persecution. That he says both to his follower, he says, hey, this is things you need to watch out for, but this doesn't mean the end. When you see these massive wars and all that, like these earthquakes or famine, this isn't the end. These are things that are going to be true basically throughout all of history. But in verse 14 of Mark chapter 13, Jesus answers their question. He tells them, this is the sign you're looking for. He's going to describe the sign to them that not only is the temple going to be destroyed, but also, as we're going to see, the sign that shows the world is going to end. Let's take a look at it. Look at verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the rooftop not go down, nor enter his house, nor take anything out. The one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I've told you all things beforehand. The world as we know it is going to end when Jesus returns. It's going to be completely different after that. Since that hasn't happened yet, talking about events that lead up to that moment is called prophecy. Prophecy has some interesting features that I want to make you aware of. And so turn to Isaiah chapter 61. So if you're in Mark, it's about 15 books to the left. Isaiah, it's huge. There's 66 chapters. I want you to turn to Isaiah 61. Shouldn't be too hard to find. If you get to Psalms or Proverbs or Ecclesiastes or Genesis, you've gone too far. So Isaiah 61, this is an interesting passage. Jesus read this passage when he preached in the synagogue that he grew up in. And this is what he did. So take a look, Isaiah 61, here's what Jesus does. And remember, what I'm showing you, here's an interesting aspect of prophecy that we need to be aware of in order to understand what he's saying in Mark 13. Isaiah 61, look at verse 1. So Jesus is given the scroll, and he starts reading in verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And that's where Jesus stopped. And he says, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So did you notice what Jesus did there? He stopped mid-sentence. He stopped at a comma. The sentence keeps going, right? To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. So there's no hint in the sentence that the comma should act this way. Jesus couldn't say the last part was being fulfilled in their hearing. It wasn't. That comma is the end of the world. That comma has lasted for 2,000 years. Now turn to Matthew 24. We were in Mark 13. Matthew's the book right before Mark. So Matthew 24 is Matthew's account of the same private briefing about the end. But my point here is that a prophet can speak of two events in the same sentence, even though they're separated by hundreds of years. So reading the prophets is like looking at these mountains right here. From our vantage point, we see mountain peaks that look like they're close to each other, but in reality, there are huge valleys in between. And in the same way, a prophet sees and hears the peaks. He sees the tops of the mountains. The timing is vague. He doesn't know that there might be hundreds or even thousands of years in between. These valleys of time, he doesn't know that. He just sees what God shows him, and he sees the tops of the valleys, and that's it. And this becomes very apparent with the sign Jesus gives the disciples, what we just read about, the abomination of desolation. This becomes kind of the hinge. This moment becomes the hinge between 70 AD and the end of the world. And to summarize what we're going to see here, I've called this point number 1 the noxious announcement. Noxious is a word that means deadly, destructive, or awful. And there's nothing is all that wrapped up into one like the abomination of desolation. Matthew gives us a little bit more than Mark. And so I want to take a look at what he says here. Drop down to verse 15. Verse 15 of Matthew 24. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So let's notice a couple things. The abomination of desolation, 3 things. First, it's going to be spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Second, we need to understand it. Third, it has a specific location. Where is that? In the holy place, in the temple. All right? So the word abomination, let's take a step back. Okay, what's being talked about here? I don't use abomination or desolation in my normal vocabulary. Maybe you do, but I don't do that very often. So let's define these words a little bit. Abomination refers to something that's just repulsive to God and his people. It provokes disgust. It's detestable, shameful, something that's deeply sinful, or the way I put it for your notes, it's something that's morally noxious. You just see it, and the immorality of it just kind of like, oh, I'm repulsed by that. Anything in the news? Kind of maybe two candidates, I don't know. The abomination pollutes something that's holy and leaves that holy place desolate. The word desolation refers to something that's abandoned or forsaken. It's kind of like where I live in Queen Creek. You just look out and just see fields of dirt. When I think of desolation, I think of Queen Creek's fields of dirt. There's just nothing at all there. So whatever this abomination of desolation is, it's so offensive and so repulsive and so sinful, it leaves the holy place, the temple, deserted by God and his people. So the question is, okay, what could this be? We know it's spoken of by Daniel. We know that Matthew and Luke both say, hey, let the reader understand this. And so we need to understand it. And I think that comment is getting at the idea that this abomination of desolation is not on the surface. It's not just something that's, oh yeah, that's easy, I know what that is. It takes research for the reader to know, like, what is this sign? It takes background that we don't have when we bring to the Bible, like the disciples did. This means that for the rest of this point, like if you're taking notes, you notice point 1 is longer than all the rest. You see that? And that's because this section, this first point is going to feel like a Bible study. We're going to go kind of deep a little bit. It's not super deep, but it's just, we need to understand this. Like it says in that verse right there, verse 15, let the reader understand. So when I read the words abomination of desolation, how many of you were just like, got that? I know what that is. All right. That means we all need to understand. So this is going to be a little bit of a Bible study right now. So we're in Matthew. Matthew says it's spoken of by Daniel. So let's turn to Daniel. So if you're in Matthew, Daniel's about 12 books, 13 books to the left. So if you get to Isaiah or Jeremiah, you've gone too far. Daniel chapter 11. Daniel is discussing world history before it happens. About 200 years after Daniel writes his book, there's a world leader called Alexander the Great. Daniel describes his reign in detail. It's absolutely phenomenal. This would turn into a series if I could go into those details on just the abomination of desolation, and we're not going to do that. But it is uncanny how specific he is. And what Daniel says is Alexander the Great is going to die, and after he dies, his kingdom is going to be divided into 4 regions. 2 of those regions are going to include Israel. Their border is going to be right in Israel, which means that these 2 kingdoms are going to fight each other all the time. All right? So in 167 BC, there is a king named Antiochus Epiphanes. He wants to attack Egypt. He's the king of the north, and he wants to attack the southern region of Egypt. But Roman officials, when he wants to do this, Roman officials show up and say, hey, we don't want you to do that. They were on the island of Crete. They got word from Rome. Rome's like, hey, we don't want him to do that. So they sail over and say, hey, Antiochus, none of that. You're not allowed to do that. Well, this is exactly what Daniel said would happen 400 years earlier. Look at Daniel 11, drop down to verse 29. At the time appointed, he, this is king of the north, shall return and come into the south. So here he is. He wants to go down and make war, like I said, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So he's not going to get to do that. Why? Verse 30. For ships of Kittim, Kittim is the Hebrew word for the island of Cyprus. Ships from Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged. Right? So exactly what happened. Roman officials came, said, we don't want you to do that. He's afraid of Rome, so he goes, okay, I'm not going to do that. Humiliated, he agrees reluctantly, he's frustrated. What he does is he takes his frustration out on the Jews. Look at verse 30. He shall be afraid and withdraw, shall turn back and be enraged, and take action against the holy covenant. There it is. So here's what Antiochus did. He came to Jerusalem under the pretense of peace. He said, you don't have anything to worry about here. I was going to go make war with those people in Egypt, but you know, and I'm not going to do that. I'm a merciful guy. So he just shows up, but this is what he does. Here's his plan. On the Sabbath day, when all the Jews are resting, not allowed to do any work, they got to worship and all of that, that's when we're going to attack them. 250,000 soldiers went all over the land of Israel and started killing Jews. And after he did that, after that starts, he installs his own apostate high officials in Jerusalem. So he takes like the high priest and other government officials, has those people killed, and puts his own people in there, people that were Jewish but wanted nothing to do with Judaism. Let's take a look at verse 30. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Excuse me. Something's wrong with my voice today. So thank you for your patience. So here he is saying, I'm going to pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. And this is exactly what he did. Well, after doing all of that, here's what he does. How many of you know that Jewish people don't like pigs? It's not allowed to eat pig. You don't do that. Old Testament, all that stuff. Well, he shows up and sacrifices a pig on their altar. First, no. Second thing he does is he makes all the priests who are still alive eat it before he kills them. So they're eating pig flesh. Total no for them. Then he says, you know what? Finally, what we're going to do is we need to have one world religion. So everybody inside my kingdom is going to worship Zeus. And so he makes a statue of Zeus, places it right on top of the burnt altar, and says, everybody must worship this. Again, exactly like Daniel said he would do. Look at verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offerings. That happens. There's a big statue of Zeus there. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So what is that? That is the acts of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. That is the pigs defiling the temple. That's the statue. Now, turn to Daniel chapter 12. See, I told you this is going to be like a Bible study. Daniel chapter 12. This is the second time that Daniel uses this phrase, the abomination of desolation. Only this time, if you look at verse 9, he's not talking about something that he's talking about the end of the world. Look at verse 9. He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Okay, so that's the context, the end. Let's keep reading. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. The wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. Verse 11, and from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. Verse 13, but go your way till the end. And you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. My point here is this. 167 BC was not the end, right? History didn't end there. History kept going. So the abomination of desolation is going to reappear before the end of the world. That's what we have here. It comes back again. Now turn back to Mark 13. Mark 13. Mark 13:14 says, but when you see the abomination of desolation. You see that? When you see the abomination of desolation. So he's talking to his early followers and says, when you see this. Well, how could they see this if it happened 167 years earlier? How could these guys see this in 30 AD when it happened in 167 BC? The answer is it's got to happen again. Right? So what we saw from Daniel is this. Here's Daniel. He's dressed a little differently than Daniel the prophet, 2,500 years ago. But what we saw is, okay, he sees this abomination of desolation in 167 BC, and he also saw it at the time of the end in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. But when Jesus says to his followers in 30 AD, hey, you're going to see this too, you're going to see the abomination of desolation, then what we have is Jesus pointing to a third time when this is going to be seen. This is about as clear as mud right now. I hope this is making a little sense. So the abomination of desolation is what happened in 167 BC. It happens at the time of the end, and it's what Jesus is telling his followers, hey, when you see this, you need to run, you need to get out of here. This is important. So what we find is that there's over a 200-year valley of time between the first and second abominations of desolation. There's almost a 2,000-year valley between the second and the third. So the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the events describing the destruction of the people in 167 BC, all foreshadow or are like previews of coming attractions at the end of the world. So what's the point? Well, the first point is this: whether it's Daniel or Jesus, again, we are not talking about gimmicky 1-900 number psychics. We are talking about the real deal. There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he revealed it to both of those men. So then what is this event that Jesus is talking about? Lots of disagreement here. If you spend any time looking at this, you know lots of disagreement. I read one guy that's like, there's 7 possibilities for what this could be. Not helpful. When Jesus says, let the reader understand, you're like, really? Like, I got to figure out 7 possibilities? Because here's the thing, their criteria, like, for instance, the abomination of desolation cannot be the destruction of the temple, right? Because by the time the Roman armies arrived, like, you weren't allowed to flee the city. If you tried to get out of the city when the Roman armies arrived, they would kill you. So it was too late. If it's the destruction of the temple, it's too late. You can't flee at that time. They'd kill or enslave those people. So whatever it is, it's the sign that disaster is coming. It's not the disaster itself. So that's the first thing. It's also an observable event. So notice in chapter 13, verse 14 again, it says, when you see. It also, another criteria is it has to happen in the temple, right? That takes place, Matthew says, in the holy place. And finally, look at verse 14 again. Mark 13:14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be. Is that what your Bible says? It should say standing where he ought not to be. That's the accurate translation of the Greek words in this passage, is the word he. What's the point? The abomination of desolation is not an event, it's a person. It's a person. Whoever he is, he will do horrible things that leave the temple abandoned. So when we put all that criteria together, is there an event that happened before 70 AD that would have told Jesus' followers, this is what Jesus was talking about. We need to get out of here. And there is. There's one event. It happened in 67 to 68 AD, about 6 months, 5 to 6 months, at the end of 67, lasting into the spring of 68. And I want to describe this to you so that you can see, okay, what was Jesus talking about? What were the events? Who is the person that when they saw him doing what he did, they would have gone, that's it right there. If you were alive at the time, you would have heard Jesus' words here. You'd have seen this guy and you would have gone, kids, let's get out of here. This is it. So what happened in the winter of 67 is there were these group of zealots who showed up in Jerusalem, a whole gang of them. And zealots were a group of people who believed strongly that the Jews should fight Rome. They shouldn't give in. They shouldn't play safe with Rome. They shouldn't assimilate with Roman culture either. They shouldn't be their own culture but try to live peaceably with the Romans. They should go to war. We would call these people terrorists. So in the winter of 67 AD, they enter the city under the leadership of a man named John of Giscala. I really wish it wasn't John, but that was his name, John of Giscala. So these zealots became roaming gangs within the walls of Jerusalem. And these guys would go around and steal people's stuff. They would go around actually just murdering people. Like, they would kidnap the most prominent people in the city. and just execute them. They would make up charges against them. They would say, oh, they're conspiring with Rome, let's kill them all. But really, they just kill them and take all their stuff. Josephus, remember, he's a first century Jewish historian. He's actually alive during this time. He's actually a part of this rebellion, but eventually escapes. And when he escapes and goes to Rome, Rome doesn't kill him, but he becomes friends with Titus, who becomes the next emperor, which is really great for him, which allowed him to write a history of the Jews. He was there at this time, and he describes these men by saying, quote, they trampled the laws of men and God. Quote, they mocked the Old Testament. How did they do that? Well, this John guy has this idea, like he's getting rid of all of the people that would stand in his way, and one of them was the high priest. So he says, hey, let's elect our own high priest. Only this guy did not have the lineage. He didn't have the training. He was just his puppet. And this priest just made a mockery of the priesthood, violated God's laws. So the priests who were alive in Jerusalem at that time were watching this, and Josephus describes how they just mourned and wept like, God, why are you judging us, allowing this to take place? He also wrote that these wicked men, quote, entered the temple with polluted feet. They turned the Holy of Holies into like their own private like club where they hung out. And so he says that they made it, quote, a refuge for criminals, and, quote, a shop for tyranny. So these guys are completely polluting the temple, doing things that God said, you are not allowed to do these things. And then it gets worse because they start to sense like there's growing hostility within Jerusalem against us. And then and there really was. And so they call their friends who are mercenaries to say, hey, come to us and help us. And so now you've got these zealots and a bunch of foreign mercenaries all on the Temple Mount. And this is their home. This is kind of like what they're doing. They're raiding bands are going into the city and pillaging the people. High priest, the true high priest, he's had enough. So he rallies a bunch of people. He says, hey, everybody, come with me. Let's go take our temple back. God is with us, and a bunch of other prominent people. We can do this. So they attack to reclaim their city. And these mercenaries were just merciless. 8,500 people, Josephus said, were dead up on the Temple Mount, and that blood was coming out of the Holy of Holies. Like this was just desecrated. After this, in response to this kind of coup attempt against the zealots, they decided, you know what, we're just going to kill everybody. So they found every prominent person that was left. They had mock trials up on the Temple Mount, executed them up on the Temple Mount, including the true high priest. And Josephus says, once that happened, once they killed the true high priest, he said, it was at that moment that he considered this, God has abandoned this place. This is ripe for judgment. So I think John of Giscala and what happened with the zealots, what they did under his leadership, is the abomination of desolation. Once they entered the temple, once they installed their imposter high priest, once they killed thousands in the temple, it was defiled. There was no possible way that God was sitting there going, oh, that's fine. He was done like this is God's judgment if this is happening. This is highly offensive, highly sinful, and detestable to God. And here's the thing. If people saw this happening in this moment, if they were there or they heard about it and they heard these things going on, if they left at that time, they'd have missed everything. They'd have missed everything that happened in the city from 67 to 68. Towards the end of 68, the Roman army starts coming back into the region. And when the Roman army started coming into the region, they just started attacking everybody, all the Jews. Like it wasn't just in Jerusalem. On the way from into Jerusalem, all the cities and towns, they started just killing everybody. This was a bloodbath. If they listened, if they saw this happen and left, they'd have been saved. They'd have been safe from all of these things. Now, that, I think, is what Jesus is talking about in Mark 13:14. Gives people enough time to get out and be safe. It's not everything the Bible says about the abomination of desolation. Like we saw Daniel 12:11, there's this third abomination of desolation near the time of the end. And remember, what are we doing right now? We are being obedient to what Matthew and Mark wrote when they said, let the reader understand. What is the abomination of desolation? Well, there is a third one. Turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, about 10 books to the right. This abomination of desolation is also a person. It also takes place in the temple, which doesn't exist right now, but which means that, at least I believe, someday it's going to be rebuilt. This person is who John, Jesus' cousin, calls the Antichrist, or who Paul calls the man of lawlessness. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, look at verse 3. Let no one deceive you in any way. For that day, the return of Jesus, that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. Now watch, here's what he does. He opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so he's a rival God. So much so, in fact, that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So the abomination of desolation in Mark 13:14 alludes to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but that's not an exhaustive reference. Jesus is also referring to this blasphemous activity of the Antichrist just before his second coming. Now, turn back to Mark 13. We've been all over the Bible just now. The quick survey of the abomination of desolation is over. Hopefully you understand what that is now. Looking at Daniel and Matthew and Mark and 2 Thessalonians. We didn't have time to go into Revelation. All of this points to at least 3 occurrences of this event. 167 BC, 70 AD, and some other time in the future that we don't know about yet. Now, when Jesus' followers saw or heard about this taking place in Jerusalem, what were they supposed to do? You're in Mark 13 now, look at verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the rooftop not go down or enter his house or take anything out. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, it's going to be rough. You need to get out of there fast. You need to go so fast you don't even go downstairs to get anything. If you're in the field, you don't go to your house and grab your jacket and keep going. You need to get out as fast as you can. Pray, verse 18, that it may not happen in winter. So verse 14, when you see, then you flee. The abomination of desolation is the sign the disciples were to look for. It's the sign they were asking for in 13:4. But here's the thing. This is revolutionary because this is what people at the time thought. They thought, if it's not safe, I need to go into the city. Inside the city, there's a wall that protects us. We have all of our supplies in the city. Why would we leave the city? And then when it comes to Jerusalem in particular, the people there would have been like, no, God will never let Jerusalem be destroyed. We will definitely be safe here. And you know what Josephus tells us? That when the Roman army started descending back into Judea, and Judea would be the county and Jerusalem would be the city, as they were going into Judea, the people ran into the city of Jerusalem. Jesus did not agree with that conventional wisdom. So I've called this point number 2 the necessary avoidance. The necessary avoidance. Some want to argue that these words are hyperbole, and that's fine, but if they were, it was for a reason. There were battles, like I said, all over Judea as the Roman armies crushed every city on the way to Jerusalem. When they heard of any rebellion, these zealots actually came into Jerusalem in 67 because they'd been defeated in other cities along the way. And so no matter where you were, you had no time to wait. He doesn't say those who are in Jerusalem should flee. It says those who are in Judea, anywhere in this county, you need to get out of here as soon as this abomination of desolation takes place. Action cannot be delayed. Quick, decisive, immediate response is the only way to save your life, Jesus is saying. Mountains are these uninhabited places where you'd be safe, where armies aren't going to want to go, zealots aren't going to waste their time there. You're going to be safe there. And guess what happened? Early church historian named Eusebius said the Christians got out of Judea when they saw these things happening. They did exactly what Jesus said. They fled to the mountains, and then from the mountains, they fled to a place called Pella, which was north of Jerusalem by about 60 miles or so. And this was a region that were Gentiles, and so they didn't have any problem with Rome. It was great. The Roman army wasn't going to come there, so all these Christians went to the city. They relaxed as Jerusalem and Judea burned. And Pella is in a mountainous region as well. They took Jesus' prophecy literally. They got out of there and they were safe. And why the rush, Jesus? Why the dire warnings? Why the urgency? Look at verse 19. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now and never will be. If the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. So not heeding Jesus' warning would have been a fatal mistake. It was a fatal mistake. Josephus tells us that 97,000 Jews were led into slavery or captivity, but 1.1 million died from starvation or from the sword. I decided not to read those parts to you from Josephus. It's riveting, but it's disgusting. The things that he saw taking place in that city, the things that he witnessed are just horrific. We have no idea what tribulation or devastation truly is. The worst possible things that you and I have ever experienced all put together, I don't think matches what he saw in that city. Notice verse 18. Jesus didn't say, hey, pray for the city. Hey, pray that God will be patient. Pray that everything's going to work out okay. Just pray that it doesn't happen in winter. In other words, it's going to happen. Its fate is inevitable. Don't miss that. 70 AD was about the judgment of God for rejecting his son. When Jesus says these words, that these boulders, these rocks are going to fall to the ground, this temple is going to be destroyed, he says that right after the Jewish people and the Jewish officials all said, basically, we want nothing to do with you. Get out of here. The city would fall, and like we've seen so far, it did exactly as Jesus said it would 40 years after he said it would happen. This is why I called this point number 3, the nuclear affliction. The nuclear affliction. It's not nuclear like nuclear bombs, although Jesus' statement in verse 20 about no human surviving made little sense until scientists split the atom. But it's nuclear in the sense of utter chaos or just absolute craziness or devastation in a hugely heightened way. It's like when someone, just really loses it, we say oh man, she went nuclear on that guy. God went nuclear on Jerusalem. Many see here a reference to this in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, when it says that, quote, at the time shall arise Michael, the great prince who is in charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as has never been since there was a nation till that time. But Daniel 12, as we saw, is talking about the end. Talking about a conflict that comes near the time of the end. And so I actually think verse 19 is one of those 2 mountain peak kind of verses. Let me try to explain why. I was stopped in the lobby between services and can you explain that again? So hopefully I do a good job this time. I didn't do that last time. So here's what I think 70 AD is. Look at verse 19. So this I think is 70 AD when Jesus says, for in those days, in the days of the abomination of desolation, in the days when you need to flee, there will be such a tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now. So from this point all the way back into the Bible, this will be the worst thing that's ever happened. We go back and read the Old Testament, we go, yeah, there's nothing that was this bad. There were bad things, but it wasn't this bad. And then he says, and never will be. Well, is that true? That 70 AD is the worst thing that's happened in the history of the world? Just think of World War II. 40 to 80 million people died. 6 million Jews died. I think what Jesus does here is that up until, in verse 19, up until that word now, that's 70 AD. After that comma, and never will be, that's the time of the end. I think he skips ahead 2,000 years there. Why? Because the words and never will be means that it's such a severe conflict that it has no parallel in human history after 70 AD. And that's, like I said, that's just not true. Like World War II. Once again, Jesus predicts the future in detail. He's deadly accurate. And it's also, look at verse 20. If you're thinking, okay, is verse 20, is that talking about the end or is that talking about 70 AD? Well, let's look at it. The Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. Well, the whole human race was not in danger in 70 AD. Like, it's bad. It was really bad, but the whole human race wasn't in danger. And notice it says there that he cuts short the days. Why? For the sake of what? The sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Well, here's the thing. If the elect are Christians, which is what most scholars think, where were the Christians during 70 AD? Where were they? Were they in Jerusalem at the time? Were they sitting there like, oh, God, please protect us, save us, rescue us? No, they were gone. They'd already left, so they weren't even in Jerusalem at the time. And so cutting short the days, like, first, the Christians aren't even there. And second of all, it took 5 months for the Romans to destroy Jerusalem. But once they got in, they didn't go, hey, you know what? Let's just let them all go. You know, it's been rough on them and rough on us. Let's just show mercy and just let everybody go free. That's not what happened. The Romans came in and killed everybody. So it doesn't seem like this merciful statement actually matches anything that happened in 70 AD. So when are the days going to be shortened? I think it's the return of Jesus right before the Antichrist tries to wipe the world clean of all the Jews, but we'll talk about that maybe next week. So 70 AD is a prototype of the end. Jesus speaks about the end, and he speaks about 70 AD, I think even in the same verse. So if you're like, that's so confusing, well then let's just move on to point number 4, the non-believing apostates. Look at verse 21. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. False Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. The context here is the abomination of desolation. So the context here is not general false teachers like we saw a couple of weeks ago. It is specific false teaching that says this, look, here's the Christ, which means, hey, I'm the Messiah, bad things aren't going to happen. I'm the king, trust me. You don't have to worry about this. Or prophets, God told me that everything's going to work out, so you don't have to worry about this. Verses 21 and 22, I think are about a specific deception, which is saying, you don't need to get out of here. You're going to be safe. Go ahead and stay. Why do I say that? Look at verse 21. And if anyone says, notice this, those words, to you. These con men were coming after Jesus' followers. Now, Josephus doesn't tell us anything about Christians, pretty much. But what he does tell us is that, just like Jesus says, prophet and messianic figures came in, spoke to the Jews, said, hey, you don't have to worry about the Romans. I'm going to defeat them for you. Or you don't have to worry about this. God's going to take care of you. So you just come into the city and be safe. Everything's going to work out fine. And it was the exact opposite. Jesus is saying, don't believe their lies. Don't follow them. It's impossible. It says in verse 21 or 22, it's impossible to lead you astray. But if you are led astray even for a second, enough time to go back into your house and not come out, you could be in danger. So don't even let it happen. Now, he concludes with this, verse 23. But be on guard. I've told you all things beforehand. As you said before, he doesn't say this stuff because he's interested in the sensational or the minutia of all of the different details. What he's interested in is their lives. He's interested in how they're going to respond. Like, he's interested in his people in the midst of all of the world falling apart. What do they need to know? What do they need to hear? This is the heart behind his words, and so he gives his followers, point number 5, the new awareness. Jesus doesn't tell them or us everything we might want to know about the end or about 70 AD. He just told them and us everything we need to know. It's going to be easy in the coming days. It's already been easy in the past decades to look out at the world and go, gosh, what's going on here? Where is God? Jesus goes, you don't need to be confused. You know the end before it begins. There's no reason to be misled by false teachers or crazy things on the news. Like, he knows the end before it begins, and we do too. There's no reason for them or us to be afraid. We know the end before it begins. There's really no reason for them to be surprised in 70 AD or for us to be surprised if the world started to end today. We know the end before it begins. Forewarned is forearmed, right? Think about this. You ever watch, is there anyone who doesn't watch football anymore? I guess I shouldn't ask that question. If you're ever watching a football game and you've got the quarterback, he walks up to the line of other players, and when he sees something that he doesn't like, he starts doing these like hand motions and shouting out words like Omaha or something like that. And you're just like, what? Like you hear that, right, on your TV, and you're like, what are they talking about Nebraska for? Like, that's kind of strange. Like, and he's doing these weird hand motions. Well, all of those hand motions and code words say this, basically: I don't like the defense I'm looking at, so I'm going to change the play right now. Right? And this hand motion means you go here, and this code word means you go there, and I'm changing this whole thing on the fly. Well, a couple years ago in the Super Bowl, the Broncos were picked to just destroy the Seahawks. You remember this? But the Seahawks destroyed the Broncos. And then it came out after the Super Bowl. Did you hear about this? The Seahawks had all the code words, and they had all the hand signals. They figured it out somehow. So that no matter what Peyton Manning was saying at the line, no matter what he said or all of those hand motions, they were like, yeah, I know what's going on here. Nothing new here. I know what's coming. Same is true for Christians and the end of the world, which is really helpful nowadays. You think about it. There's a lot of doomsday predictions that we're supposed to be afraid of these days. Super viruses wiping out the population, an asteroid hitting our planet, a new ice age, gamma ray bursts, super volcanoes that erupt for hundreds of years, pole shifts, or the sun burning out, or global warming, or aliens, like all kinds of things. Prophecy allows you to hear about all that stuff and laugh or yawn and say, Jesus already told us how the world is going to end. He didn't say it was going to happen like that. I don't need to worry about this. I hope that no matter who becomes the next president, whether all of our liberties are taken away, or whether there's no food at the store, or whether there's all the electricity goes out, or whether an earthquake breaks California off and it floats away, or whatever it might be, I hope that no matter what happens in this world, the words of Jesus are shouting louder than your fears, are shouting louder than your doubts, are shouting louder than anything else that you might see or hear, and you're able to say, this isn't the end. I can trust him. I know what the truth is, so I can be on my guard. I hope you have that hope. I hope you know what that hope is, and if you don't, right now, before I say anything else, talk to him. Say, God, why don't I have this hope? Why don't I have this? Talk to him. Find out. And I would encourage you, give him your life. Trust him. Bring him into your heart. Let his truth transform you. Don't go another day not taking him seriously. Let's pray. God, there's so much in this passage that's hard to understand, and yet you said, let us understand it. I can only hope that you have allowed us to understand your truth better now as we leave than before we walked in here. It's easy to bottom line things and go, Jesus is in charge, or trust him, or things like that. But you commanded your people to understand what this is. And so I pray that you would do that in our hearts today. I pray that you would be our teacher as we learn those things, and help us, God. Help us to make sense of this world. Doesn't make sense. Thank you for Jesus, who tells us everything beforehand so that we can be on guard. Thank you for your truth. Amen.